Alverscroft and Boldwood present Chasing Dreams on Sunshine Island, written by Georgina Troy and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jax carried the 2 metal buckets filled with mussels along the beach, barely noticing the seawater sloshing against his legs, despite the icy wind sweeping inland from the sea as it spilled over the rim. Beth would probably be wrapping some of the presents she had bought for her little boy, Billy's 3rd Christmas. He smiled as he recalled Beth's pretty face looking up at him that first time he had held her in his arms, and they'd danced together at Vicky and Dan's wedding 5 months before. Jax whistled for his little rescue dog, Seamus, to come to him. Billy loved Seamus, and Jax pictured the excited child who he'd become fond of since he and Beth had begun seeing each other soon after the wedding. It was the first time Jax had been in a relationship with someone who had a child, and he had to admit he rather enjoyed spending time with the 2 of them. Being an only child with only his cousin, Piper, close to him in age, spending time with Billy had been a new experience. Jax enjoyed teaching the school children who came to him in their groups to learn how to forage, but apart from that, he'd never really spent much time with youngsters. Beth was good fun, and although he sensed that their relationship wasn't progressing as quickly as his relationships usually did, he supposed it was because she had to put her son's needs before either of theirs, and it gave him an insight into how it must feel to have a child. Jax loved that they had fun with Billy over meals and were then able to enjoy relaxed evenings together when the little boy was asleep in his room. What had surprised Jax most was how close he had become to Billy. He'd never really seen himself as a father before now. Probably, he thought with a wry grin, that until recently he'd barely thought of himself as much of a grown-up. He was beginning to think that it might be time to find his own place and finally move out of his parents' home, when his toe connected with a large pebble and pain shot up through his foot, making him wince. "Ow, that was sore," he grumbled, aware that most people would think him mad for walking barefoot on the beach in December. Lowering both buckets onto the sand, he reached down and gave his toe a gentle rub. He frowned to see that the tip of his big toe had already begun darkening. He was going to have a nasty bruise in a couple of hours. That'll teach him not to wear shoes. He groaned, his pain turning to amusement at the thought of his mother, Sheila's, words when she saw what he'd done to himself when he dropped off the mussels he had collected for her before taking the others to Helen's home and then on to Marjorie's. "Hey, Seamus, come on, boy," he shouted, patting his knees and waiting for his damp dog to lope up to him. "We better get you home and dry you off, otherwise Mum is not going to be happy with me, especially when I go out and leave you behind with her and Dad." He'd promised Beth he would take her some mussels too when she'd mentioned a few weeks before how much she would love to try his moule marinière at some point. Jax was hoping to encourage her to let Billy try his first moule that evening, but he would have to wait and see whether Beth agreed with him. Although Jax's father had introduced him to seafood at a very young age, he was aware that not everyone was so willing to do the same with their own children. He reached the top of the slipway and made his way to his mother's home, leaving his damp leather sandals on the front doormat on his way in. Sheila was walking out of the kitchen with a mug of tea in her hand when she looked up and saw him. "Look at the state of you 2, she said, shaking her head in amusement as he held the door open until Seamus had run inside. She looked at the dog and wrinkled her nose. "Are you barefoot?" She shook her head, frowning. "For pity's sake, Jax, and you've hurt yourself by the looks of things." "It was only a little bump," he fibbed, trying to avoid a telling off. "I can see that it wasn't by the shade of purple on your toe." She grimaced in Seamus's direction. "And you can dry that little shadow of yours off before you do anything else. I don't want him jumping up on my furniture while his fur is all wet and sandy." "Will do." "Honestly, Jax, I thought that now you had a girlfriend you might at least attempt to look a little less dishevelled." "Mum, I've just walked off the beach on a rainy December evening. I'm not sure how else you expect me to look just now." "Wearing shoes might be a good start." And there it was, he thought, amused, his mum telling him off again. "Anyway, Beth likes me just the way I am," he said, not exactly sure what she actually saw in him. Yes, but I wonder how long that will last after the honeymoon period ends. He wasn't sure what his mother was going on about, but didn't argue. Then he watched her raise one eyebrow in that way she had of asking and answering a question at the same time. No one wants a man who looks as messy as you do right now. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Mum. Did he really look that bad? I'm only being honest, and if I can't be straight with my own son, then there's something very wrong with this world. Fine. He sighed heavily, aware that agreeing with her was the quickest way to encourage his mum to stop having a go at him. I'll think about what you've said and tidy myself up a bit. That's all I'm suggesting you do, she said, taking a sip of her tea and giving him a satisfied smile. He lowered one of the buckets onto the mat by the front door and carried the other through to the kitchen. I'll give these a quick wash, then leave them in salted water to allow them to purge themselves. Perfect, Sheila said, following him back to the kitchen and leaning against the wall, cupping her mug of tea in her hands as she watched him decant some of his catch. How do you think you'll cook them? He asked, always intrigued to know what recipe people intended trying out. I'm not sure, she answered thoughtfully. I might fry up a little of that chorizo I bought from the market in town last week, then add a dash of red wine, possibly a little passata. What do you think? Sounds delicious. It did. If Beth hadn't specifically asked him to make his moule marinara recipe, that he'd already told her included a finely chopped garlic clove, some shallots, Jersey double cream, local butter and a splash of Jersey cider, he might have asked his mother for some of her chorizo. I'll give that a try next time. He thought of the crusty cabbage loaf he'd bought for him and Beth to use to dip into the delicious creamy sauce once they'd eaten their mussels. He suspected Billy would enjoy eating the sauce-soaked bread best of all. There you go, Mum, Jax said 3/4 of an hour later, washing and drying his hands before giving Sheila a peck on her forehead. I hope you and Dad enjoy those. I might see you later if you're not in bed by the time I come home from Beth's. Thanks, love. She reached up and patted his right cheek. You're having a shower before you go, I hope. What did his mother take him for? Of course I am. I'll be back for that after I've dropped off for the rest of these with Helen and Marjorie. Righty-ho. Showered and feeling much warmer now he was wearing dry clothes, Jax left his clean, dry dog snoring in front of the fireplace as his mother watched one of her property renovation programs. Have a good evening, Mum, he said, grabbing the keys to his Jeep from the key hook picture hanging from the wall near the door. Thanks for looking after Seamus for me. It's no effort to sit in front of the telly with the little chap, she said. You go and have a fun time. He smiled as he drove his Jeep up to Beth's holiday cottage. She was always great company, as well as being the most attractive woman he had ever seen. He neared the small stone cottage that she was renting from one of the local farmers for the time being, until she found somewhere more permanent for her and Billy to move into. He parked the Jeep, picking up the basket of his mother's that he had borrowed, checked the bottle of red wine he had brought with him, along with the crusty cabbage loaf and the large plastic container with the moule, hoping she was going to enjoy the meal he was about to make for her. He was looking forward to his evening with Beth. Jax made sure that the smaller containers with the rest of his ingredients hadn't become loose before running the short way from the car to the small porch. It wouldn't give the right impression for him to arrive at Beth's door wet and dishevelled, especially when he'd assured his mother he was trying to make an effort to look his best for her. He tapped lightly on the door, not wishing to ring the doorbell in case Billy had fallen asleep early. That was another thing he learnt from spending time with the pair of them, that if the little boy fell asleep, it was tantamount to being a traitor to wake him up before Beth was ready for Billy to wake up. He saw her figure hurrying towards the door through the mottled glass, and his heartbeat quickened to picture her smiling face. The door pulled back, and there she was, his Beth. Hello, he said, unable to help from grinning at her. Hello, you, she replied, stepping forward and kissing him before taking his free hand and leading him into the hallway. Apart from a 3-year relationship with his first serious girlfriend, which began when he was 17, most of his relationships had been short-lived. Most women, he discovered, didn't like spending time walking on cold beaches only to return to their boyfriend's parents' home afterwards. He hadn't minded not being part of a couple, mostly because he was a little nervous that a serious relationship might alter his day-to-day life and the amount of time he was free to wander about the island with Seamus. You hobbling? Beth asked, peering down at his foot. Stubbed my toe earlier. She shook her head and grinned at him. Barefoot again, I presume? She didn't wait for him to answer. As long as you're all right. I'm fine, thanks. Come this way, she said, before turning and leading the way through to her small kitchen. Jax immediately began cleaning the mool. He liked cooking for Beth and Billy and tried to picture his own kitchen and how much he would enjoy preparing meals for them both if he did move into his own place. He definitely needed to think about this idea more seriously, he decided. I'll leave you to sort out all those tasty bits you bought for our supper and go and check on Billy, she said, cocking her head in the direction of the living room. He's asleep on the sofa. Not in his bed? Jax asked. It wasn't like Beth not to put the little boy to bed once he fell asleep. She shook her head. No, she whispered. He was desperate to stay awake to see you, so I let him snooze in the living room and promised to bring you through to see him when you arrived. The thought that the little boy wanted to see him so much touched Jax's heart. He's such a great kid. Beth's smile slipped, and Jax instinctively knew she was thinking about her late husband, Will. I'm sorry, he said, reaching out to rub her upper arm. I should think before speaking. She shook her head. Don't be silly. You were being nice and I appreciate it. It's strange, though, how thoughts of Will come into my head when I don't expect them to. They're bound to, Jax sympathized, especially when you're talking about or thinking about Billy. She hugged herself, and Jax wanted to take her in his arms and comfort her, but sensed it wasn't the right thing to do at that moment. I can't help being upset to think how much Will has already missed. Her voice tightened with emotion. And all the things he's not going to experience with Billy going forward. Jax hated to think of how deeply Beth must have suffered since Will's sudden death the year before. I still find it hard to believe that someone as fit as Will could suddenly die. He was always so careful about his health. Her voice trailed off. Jax recalled his mother telling him how Will was an experienced cyclist and had had a heart attack while out cycling one morning. They stilled, hearing Billy's voice calling out to Jax. Jax, is that you? The sweet voice called. His slight lisp seemed more obvious now that he was tired. Jax smiled automatically and went through to the living room. It is. Have you come to see me? Jax saw Beth enter the room and stand at the other end of the sofa, a wide smile on her face. I told you he would, didn't I? Yes. He kicked the blanket from his legs, stood, and then ran around the sofa and into Jax's open arms as Jax crouched to welcome him. Did you bring those things for me to eat? The mussels, I did. Can I help you cook them? Jax followed Billy's gaze towards Beth. Can he, Mummy? Jax asked, feeling sure that Beth would agree. She tapped her lower lip with one of her fingers and pretended to give their request some thought. I'm not sure you'll know what to do, Billy. Jax stood as Billy's hand slipped into his and pulled a pleading expression in her direction. I'll make sure he keeps well away from anything hot or sharp, and we promise to clear up any mess. He looked down at Billy. Don't we? We will, Mummy, every bit. Then I leave you both to make supper. She winked at Jax when Billy hugged him. Jax ruffled Billy's hair with his free hand. We should get you an apron to make sure your pajamas don't get any food on them. Shall we get started? Billy soon became bored watching Jax clean the mussels and decided to join his mummy in the living room. Jax wasn't surprised. He would have found it boring when he was little too. He carried on alone and was soon happily serving 2 bowls of the delicious seafood meal to Beth and a small bowl of the creamy sauce for Billy with 2 of the perfectly cooked mussels in it in case he wanted to try them. You didn't last long, young man, Jax teased, setting down Billy's and Beth's bowls in front of them at the round table in the living room. It was boring, Billy said, looking up at him and grinning. But only a bit. Jax pushed a plate of the sliced crusty loaf in front of the little boy. Take one of these, he said, setting his own bowl onto the table and sitting down. Tear it apart like this. He demonstrated what he meant and waited while Billy copied. Then you dip it into the sauce. Billy did as he suggested, and frowning, popped a dripping piece of bread into his mouth, oblivious to the sauce running down his chin. His eyes lit up the instant the concoction hit his tongue. That's good. Delighted with the little boy's verdict, Jax smiled. Now it's Mummy's turn to tell us what she thinks. He watched Beth making an elaborate display of tasting a moule, then tearing a piece of bread, dipping it a couple of times into the sauce and eating it. Delicious. Billy clapped his hands. I helped make it, Mummy. You did? Jax teased. When Billy was settled in bed sleeping, having insisted that Jax tuck him in, he and Beth did the dishes. As Jax dried the last of the cutlery, he felt Beth watching him. He looked up and went to smile at her, but noticed she had a serious, thoughtful expression on her face. Is something the matter? He asked, a sense of foreboding coursing through him. She reached out and took the cutlery from him, hurriedly putting it away in the cutlery drawer, without taking her usual care to place the right piece in the correct section. Pushing the drawer closed with her hip, Beth took a deep breath. She's going to finish with me. Jax's heart raced, and he focused on remaining calm and not revealing his slight panic. He waited for her to speak, wishing she would do so quickly and put him out of his misery. You've had a lovely evening tonight, Jax, she said quietly. Thank you for always being so kind and including Billy. He's so fond of you, and I'm grateful to you for all that you've done for us both since the summer. It's been good for him to have a caring male figure, especially since his dad isn't here anymore. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second. He realized she was building up to a massive but. He needed to say something and struggled for a moment to think what might help dissuade her. I'm grateful that the two of you welcomed me so openly into your little family. When her gaze dropped to the floor, Jax placed the tea towel he was holding onto the work surface and took Beth's hands in his. What is it? She looked up at him, pain in her eyes, but didn't reply. Beth, please speak to me. Whatever it is, I promise I'll understand. She slowly withdrew her hands from his and crossed her arms over her chest. I was trying to think of the best way to tell you. His panic increased. Was she ill? Tell me what, Beth? I can't do this, Jax. He shook his head miserably. Do what? This. Have a relationship. I'm just not ready. Not yet. So that's what was upsetting her. Aware that to try and persuade her otherwise would be selfish, Jax nodded. It's fine. I understand. Her eyes brightened. You do, really? Yes, he said, wishing there was something he could do about her decision. You were, are, still very much in love with Will, aren't you? She nodded slowly. I am. I'm so sorry. Don't be. I never meant to hurt you, Jax. I hope you know that. Of course I do. He did, but understanding her reasons didn't help lessen the sting of what she was telling him. And I'm not sorry we've spent time together since Vicky's wedding. But I think you're ready for something more out of this relationship, and I've no idea when I'll be ready to take that next step. Jax thought back to how happy he'd been with Beth and Billy, but realized that as much as he had enjoyed kissing her, he'd never even tried to take their relationship further. Probably because he'd felt in his heart that she was still very much in love with her late husband. It's fine, Beth. I've never suffered a loss like you did losing Will, so I can only imagine how heartbreaking it is for you. You must do what's best for you and Billy. Picturing the little boy and how much fun they'd had together, Jax decided that it was worth asking if they might still go on outings occasionally. I'll understand if you want a complete break, he fibbed. But as well as being attracted to you, Beth, I also like you very much as a friend. And Billy is the greatest little boy. I don't want him to think I've forgotten him just because we don't date any longer. If it's okay with you, maybe I could take him out to the beach occasionally with Seamus. He saw her consider his request. With you too, if you prefer. It's just a thought. I don't want you to feel pushed into doing anything you don't wish to do. She smiled. Thanks, Jax. I think we'd both like that very much. Her smile slipped. I'm sorry for ending it this way. He took her in his arms and hugged her. Don't be, Jax soothed. I'm a big boy and can take disappointment on the chin." He held her silently for a moment as she slipped her arms around his back and rested her head on his chest. "I've enjoyed getting to know you both." He let his arms drop. "I'd like to drop off a small Christmas present for Billy at some point, if that's all right with you." She smiled. "That's very kind. He'd love that." "Great. I better be going." He forced a smile. Beth sighed. "Thanks, Jax." "What for?" he asked. "For understanding." She reached up and rested her hand against his left cheek. "And for being you." Chapter 2. Jax walked deep in thought as he covered the short distance along the pier from his parked jeep to his parents' house. His phone buzzed. His immediate hope that Beth might have changed her mind vanished almost instantly. Beth wasn't the type of person who came to a decision lightly, and he knew her well enough to know she would not have finished with him unless she was completely certain it was what she wanted to do. Worried she might need him for something, he checked the message. It was from Piper. He smiled to himself, thinking how much better his cousin had become at using her mobile since starting to date Alex. The text said, "Spreading the word about a thank you Christmas party up at the Cabbage Patch. Meg and Amy Echo Bichon want to invite all the artisans, as well as anyone who helped clean the second barn for Vicky and Dan's wedding, to a party on Christmas Eve. Partners welcome. Should be great fun. Hopefully Beth can arrange a babysitter and can come with you." Jax stared at the screen for a moment before pressing the phone off and returning it into his back pocket. He was going to have to let his family know that he and Beth were no longer seeing one another. Feeling too miserable to want to return home, but aware that Seamus would need a bedtime walk, he went home and collected his dog. "Let's go to the beach," he said, the familiar words causing the little dog's tail to wag frantically. They reached the slipway and began walking down onto the beach. The tide was a little way out, and relieved to have some time alone to think, Jax took off his boots. He was comforted by the familiar feeling of cold, wet sand under the soles of his feet. Most people hated the darker winter nights, but he didn't mind them too much. He enjoyed each season for different reasons, and winter to him meant that the island was quieter, and now that most of the hotels and guest houses had closed, life seemed calmer and slower, which suited his current mood perfectly. He followed Seamus along the beach, the lights from the houses on the pier reflected in the wet sand below. He loved moments like these, when he and Seamus had the beach to themselves and everything in his world was peaceful. It helped soothe his bruised heart. "Oi!" a voice he recognized bellowed. "So much for having some time alone," Jax moaned to Seamus. He heard footsteps running towards him and turned to see Piper, a puffy jacket zipped up as far as it would go and a woolly beanie pulled down over her ears. "Wait for me?" "What are you doing out here at this time?" he asked. "I thought you might be cuddled up with Alex on a sofa watching television." "He's on the mainland at the moment, visiting his parents." She reached down to ruffle Seamus's scruffy head. He had to go back to make sure Fliss returned home like she was supposed to. Piper pulled a face. She wasn't ready to leave the island, really, but her parents insisted it was time she did. They told her that until she starts earning her own living and stops relying on them for everything, she'll do as she's told and will stay there until after Christmas. Alex said she's furious with them and is in a massive strop. Poor Alex. At the mention of Alex's spoilt sister's name, Jax grimaced. "You're not kidding. She's not the easiest person to deal with. I don't envy him that job." Piper nudged his side. "You had a lucky escape there. I had no idea what you saw in her." Neither did Jax now. He thought of the beautiful but petulant girl and then Beth, so gentle and sweet, they were complete opposites. He wondered if maybe him believing he had liked Fliss might have been nothing more than being intrigued by her. Fliss had been unlike any other woman he had ever met, and now never wanted to meet. He gave Piper's comments some thought, and checking Seamus was still nearby, he pushed his cold hands into his jacket pocket. "I suppose she was a bit of a whirlwind when she arrived on the island, and you must admit she is pretty, in a confident, worldly kind of way." "I suppose so," Piper laughed. "But when have you gone for someone like her? You know, the sort of high-maintenance woman you occasionally see around here. Never, that's when. All right, clever clocks. Just because you're all loved up with Alex. He noticed Seamus start to run after something and shouted out to him, "Here, boy, come on." When Seamus took no notice, Jax groaned and began to run after him. Little bugger. "Seamus, here!" He was used to his little dog charging off on occasion, but could have done without it this late at night. "Seamus!" What the hell was his dog doing? He was never this disobedient. Then Jack saw what looked like a heap of clothes. He squinted to try and see better in the darkness, but couldn't make out what it might be. Seamus reached it and began nuzzling whatever it was, then lay down next to it. "What on earth is Seamus doing?" Piper asked. "Seamus, here, boy!" Seamus continued to ignore them. "Something's very wrong," Jack said, breaking into a run. "Even Seamus doesn't usually ignore me for this long." As he drew near, he peered down at the heap of clothes and realised with horror that it was a person. They weren't very tall, and if it wasn't for the style of the trousers and boots, he might have mistaken them for an older child. Jax crouched down next to the prone individual, worried about turning them onto their back in case they were injured. "Good boy, Seamus," he said quietly, stroking the dog's head. "Can you hear me?" he asked loudly. The person groaned. They were still alive. Relieved, Jack took off his coat just as Piper reached them. "Call an ambulance," he said, without looking up. She didn't argue, and seconds later he heard her pressing the emergency number as he covered what he now realised was an elderly woman with his coat. "Can you tell me your name?" She mumbled something, but he couldn't make out what. He heard a gasp next to him. "Dilys, is that you?" Piper immediately took off her own coat and covered the lady's legs with it. Piper and Jack sat on the damp sand next to Dilys in an effort to keep her as warm as possible. Seamus hadn't moved at all and was tucked up against the woman's stomach. Jax relaxed slightly when the woman's hand moved to rest on Seamus's head. "He's a good little dog," the woman said, sounding a little stronger. Aware he needed to keep her talking, Jax asked, "Have you been here long? Do you know what happened?" "I'm not sure." She thought for a moment. "I felt a bit dizzy and then woke up lying here. What time is it now?" Piper checked her watch. "It's a little after 8:30. "And I've been here for about 10 minutes. Oh, it feels much longer, though." Jax pushed away the thought of what might have happened to Dilys if he hadn't chosen to walk Seamus on the beach at that time. Or, he reminded himself, Seamus hadn't chosen to run off and inspect what Jax had presumed to be a pile of clothes. "I'm rather cold," Dilys said, and Jax noticed she was shivering. He began to rub her back very lightly, hoping to warm her as much as possible. "Try not to worry, we'll have you warmed up in no time," he reassured her. "The ambulance should be here very soon," Piper added gently, rubbing her hands along Dilys's legs. Spotting blue flashing lights coming along the road and turning down to the pier, Jax watched the ambulance drive as far down the pier as they dared. Piper switched on the torch on her phone and waved it. "Over here," Jax called, grateful for the full moon lighting what would otherwise be a dark beach. "Heavens," Helen said when Jax escorted Piper home and explained what had happened. "Poor Dilys. Sounds as if she had a lucky escape there." "She did." Piper indicated the kettle. "I'm a bit shaky myself for some reason." "It'll be the shock, lovey," Helen said, wrapping her arms around Piper in a hug. "Want a cup of Jax? You're looking a little peaky yourself." He shook his head. "No thanks, Auntie Helen. I'd better get this little guy home." He pictured Dilys's pale face as they took her in the ambulance and shuddered. "I wish she would have let one of us accompany her to the hospital." "So do I," Piper agreed. "But I promised to give her daughter a call once I get her number from Gran." "At least she'll have someone to look after her," Jack said, relieved. Helen shook her head and switched on the kettle. "She doesn't. Dilys lives alone," Helen said thoughtfully. "Her daughter lives near Dinar, has done since she married about 10 years ago." "That's a shame." Jax didn't like to think of the older lady returning home to an empty house. "I suppose she's used to not relying on anyone else for anything. It sounds as if she had some sort of turn." "It does." Piper took down 2 cups. "Mum, she asked, holding one up. Yes, please. Helen crossed her arms. I'll give the hospital a call in the morning and see how she's getting on. Maybe I'll ask if she can come and stay here with us for a bit. I know she only lives in the village, but she can't be alone if she's unwell, and especially not at Christmas time. That's a lovely idea, Mum. At least there'll always be one of us to look after her if she stays with us. It is a good idea, Auntie Helen. Jax gave his aunt a hug. Thank you. I'm so relieved Seamus found her. Dilys looked so helpless out there on the sand. She must have been freezing by the time we reached her. Helen unfolded her arms and rested each hand on his broad shoulders. Now you listen to me. I don't want you worrying about what might have happened, she said. Seamus found her. You two helped her, and she's now in safe hands. Hopefully she'll be fine with no harm done, all right? His aunt knew him too well. Yes, he smiled. Chapter 3. I bumped into Helen at the shop this morning, his mother said, looking up from dusting her sideboard as Jax walked into the house the following day. She phoned the hospital and the nurse there reassured her that Dilys had had a comfortable night's sleep and they're pretty sure she'll be fine. Are they discharging her then? Sheila shook her head. Not until they've carried out more tests and worked out what caused her to collapse. Soon, though, I should imagine. That's good, he said, relieved. I hope she does agree to stay with Helen and Piper at the Blue Haven. Then she'll only be a few doors down from us and I can pop in to see her if she needs me to collect anything from her home. Before I forget, Piper asked that you call in to see her when you have a minute to spare. She has something to tell you. Thanks, Mum. He glanced up at the carriage clock on the mantelpiece and checked the time. I'll go and see her now. As he always did, Jax knocked a couple of times on the front door to Piper's house and, without waiting for an answer, walked straight in and through to the kitchen where he expected to find his aunt and Piper. They weren't there. We're through here, Helen shouted. Dining room. Retracing his steps, he joined them. Good morning. I hear that Dilys is doing well. She is, Helen said. I also mentioned to the nurse that I'm happy for Dilys to come and stay with us until she's well enough to return home. I hope she takes you up on that offer. Jax looked at Piper and waited while she finished her mouthful of breakfast. Mum said you wanted me for something. Did you manage to get hold of Dilys's daughter? No. Apparently she and her husband have taken a short holiday somewhere in the Canary Islands. Their neighbour told me they should be back in a few days, so I'll call again then. Right, if that's it then, I'd better get going. Jax went to leave the room. Wait, Piper said. That wasn't why I asked you to pop round? Something wrong? It was regarding the party that I texted you about? Yes. Jax pictured the two octogenarian sisters who owned and lived in the large farmhouse, which had 2 barns at the back, the largest of which was called the Cabbage Patch, and which was where Piper and other artisans had stalls and sold their wares. It was usually a hive of activity, although not somewhere he had visited often. That's nice of them, he said, unsure what she was expecting from him. It is, Piper pulled a face. So, will you be coming? He wasn't sure what this had to do with him. He worked for himself and helped down with boat trips from Gorey, taking groups of islanders and holidaymakers from Jersey to Carteret on the French coast during the summer, or to Les Écraheuses, a small group of islands. He had nothing to do with the sisters or their farmstead. I'm not sure why I'd be invited. I only helped clean the barn for the wedding. Piper groaned. I know, but I was asked to send you that text about the party because they're including you in their invitation. You and anyone else who helped make the smaller barn look so lovely. Since Matteo's photographer took those photos of the wedding reception and medieval hall of the castle as a thank you to Casey and Tara for helping him out with his music video, the sisters have been inundated with requests for events to be held at the barn. It's another income stream for them, and they're enormously grateful to everyone who helped make it happen. I did very little, though, he said, still unsure why he should be included. Piper buttered her last piece of toast before looking up at him again. If you were anyone else, I'd assume you've just woken up and that's why you're being so dense this morning. But I know you've already been up for hours. Jax had always been an early riser, but after the upset of Beth ending their fledgling relationship and then the shock of finding Dilys, his mind had raced so much that he'd barely slept more than an hour, and that had been in fits and starts. He realised his cousin was saying his name. Jax, are you listening to anything I'm saying? Seeing the concern on his cousin's face, he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "I can see you two have something to talk about," Helen said, excusing herself and standing. "Can I fetch you some toast and tea, Jax? An egg or two, maybe?" "No, thanks, Auntie Helen. I'm fine." Helen frowned, and he knew it was because he hardly ever refused to cook breakfast from his aunt. She shrugged and left him to it, though. Piper lowered her knife next to her uneaten piece of buttered toast, sat back in her chair, and stared at him with an intensity he knew meant he was going nowhere until he'd told her what was on his mind. "Speak to me," Piper said. "This isn't just about Dilys, is it?" His cousin knew him far too well to be fobbed off with any old excuse, unfortunately. Jax shook his head and sighed. He may as well tell her now. Piper was like a terrier when she suspected he was keeping a secret from her and was bound to hound him until he admitted what was wrong with him. "Beth finished with me last night." Piper didn't speak for a few seconds. He could see by the stunned expression on her face that she hadn't seen that coming. "Jax, I'm so sorry. Did she say why?" "She still loves Will," he said. "I can't say I'm surprised." He rubbed his face. "I was more surprised that she agreed to go out with me when I asked after Dan and Vicky's wedding, to be honest." "Are you very upset?" He went to answer that he was, then stopped. Was he, really? "I did like her," he said, trying to find the right words to explain his feelings. "And I'm sorry that she didn't want to continue seeing me, but I think it's probably more that I enjoyed spending time with her and little Billy." He waited for Piper to react. Her expression softened. "What?" "Well, it's just that I've never thought of you as being the type to want a family. It seems that I was wrong." He supposed she had a point. "Up until now, I'd never thought of myself that way either," he admitted. "Do you think Beth will let you still spend some time with Billy? I'm sure she would if you asked her." "I did, and she said it was fine. We've agreed that I'll take them both out walking sometimes." He thought of the sweet little boy he had unexpectedly grown fond of over the past few months. "I'm glad," Piper said. "It would be unfair to Billy for you to simply disappear out of his life, especially as that's essentially what happened when his daddy died." Jax sighed. Poor little boy. "I know, it's horrible to think of him having to go through something so cruel when he's only, 3? "Yes." Jax could feel his spirits dipping. Mooning over Beth and what had happened wasn't going to help him get over the end of their relationship. "Anyway," he said, determined to snap out of his miserable mood. "Tell me more about this party. When did you say it was going to be held?" "Christmas Eve, or maybe the night before that. I'm not quite sure." "That's only a few days away. Can they get everything ready by then?" Piper shrugged. "I don't think there's too much to do. The artisans have all agreed to stay late and help dust the barn, wash floors and all that to make it look nice, and we've each offered to make some food and bring drink to the party, so they won't have to do too much." "So a relaxed party then, rather than anything too formal," he said, feeling much more positive about attending. "It won't be anything fussy, I know that much. They just want everyone to get together and have a bit of fun." She frowned. "I think now is the perfect time for you to go to a party and take your mind off what's happened between you and Beth, don't you?" He wasn't sure. "Maybe," he said doubtfully. Then, seeing his cousin's determined stare, he knew he may as well give in. It wasn't as if he had anything else to do. "Fine, if I must, but I won't drink, though. I'll drive you and I up there. Will your gran be coming?" "I imagine so." "Then tell her I'll take her there and home again." Piper beamed at him. "Yes. I'll tell them that you'll be there then?" "Go on, why not?" he said, aware that spending time with Piper and others that he knew from the Cabbage Patch might be fun. "Just let me know if I can help in any way and what you'd like me to bring on the night." It would have been nice to be able to attend with Beth, but he presumed she wouldn't have been able to go anyway unless her mother or sister were available to babysit, and Vicky would more than likely be going to the party with Dan. "Phoebe's going," Piper said unexpectedly. Jax wasn't sure why Piper was telling him. Does that mean Fliss will be there too? Had he misheard his cousin when she told him that Fliss was having to stay in Poole for Christmas? Piper shook her head and rolled her eyes heavenward. Jax was confused. "Nope, I told you she's back in Poole, remember?" "Sorry, my mind is all over the place this morning, but I'm glad that Fliss won't be there. He'd had enough of Fliss and her exhausting ways back in the summer and was relieved to know he wouldn't be confronted by her and her silly games during the party. He realised Piper was still speaking. Phoebe helped out when we prepared the reception, so I invited her yesterday afternoon. She narrowed her eyes. That's not a problem for you, is it? No, why would it be? I wasn't sure how it was between you after Fliss was such a pain to you in the summer, Piper said. I mean, Phoebe seems nice enough, but she is Fliss's best friend, so they can't be too different, can they? How should I know? He pictured the pretty girl who'd been in their group most of the time Alex's spoiled sister, Fliss, had been there. Phoebe seems much nicer than Fliss, but she's... He struggled to work out what it was about the beautiful girl with the sleek dark hair that he had a problem with. A bit too glossy for you? Piper teased, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Jax knew his cousin was having a dig at his clothes, unshaven face and untidy, sun-bleached hair. There's nothing wrong with how I dress. Really? Are you sure about that? She laughed. How many other people do you see going out in late December wearing shorts and a t-shirt? I'm wearing a jacket now, it's cold, and boots. That's not much of a concession to the cold. Piper laughed. You should be wearing jeans and a pullover in this weather, maybe a hat too. Now I know you're joking. He had thought about wearing jeans, but decided that foraging on a wet beach would only mean they would get wet anyway. And what use would they be then, trying to warm his legs? None, that's what. Am I, though? She raised an eyebrow. Chapter 4. Christmas Eve. Jax took Dillis's hand and slipped it around his forearm to assist her into Helen's guest house from the front seat of his Jeep. You're such a kind boy, Dillis said as she and Jax walked slowly down the hallway behind Helen towards the dining room. Helen had asked Piper to prepare a bowl of soup and some bread for Dillis before she was settled up in the bedroom they'd made ready for her stay. It's my pleasure, Jax said honestly. You must be pleased to be out of hospital now. I am, and just in time for Christmas. She spotted Piper carrying a tray towards her. Oh, Piper dear, that looks delicious. Sit here, Dillis, Piper said, putting the tray onto the nearby table and pulling back a chair for Dillis to take a seat. If you don't like ham and pea soup, I'll happily make you something different. Not at all. This looks and smells delicious. Do you want me to take Dillis's bag upstairs, Auntie Helen? Jax asked, feeling happier than he had in days now that Dillis was well and looking so delighted to be at the Blue Haven. No thanks, lovey. I can do that. You get on now. Shall I come to yours later? Piper asked, looking expectantly at him. Sure. I'm dropping off a present for Billy first, but I'll come back and fetch you straight afterwards. Piper frowned. Look, why don't I make my own way there? I don't want you to be worried about time if you and Beth have things to say to each other. No, it's fine. As far as he was concerned, Beth had made up her mind, and he was simply going to have to navigate his emotions in his own way. She looked concerned, which didn't surprise him. Piper always looked out for him when things were difficult. Are you sure, though? We mostly need a lift back home after the party. It's no problem at all. I'm happy to take you there as well as bringing you home. Jax said goodbye to the three women and walked the short distance along the pier to his parents' home. He decided that he was looking forward to Christmas Day and spending time with them, Piper and his aunt. It was a tradition he always looked forward to, and this year Dillis being included could only add to the festive celebrations. As usual, he and his parents would walk to the Blue Haven guest house at around noon, when his mother would help his aunt with final preparations for a mid-afternoon meal. He thought of Dillis and how happy she'd seemed to be spending Christmas with both families. Yes, he mused. Christmas was going to be fun. He pushed his hands deep into his shorts pockets to protect them against the cold. Stopping at the harbour wall, Jax breathed in deeply. He suspected they were about to be hit by a storm. He noticed the blue-grey altostratus clouds making their way from the French coast. Not a storm, snow, and soon by the looks of things, he decided. He didn't have long to walk Seamus if he was going to get to Beth's before Billy's bedtime. He found Seamus lying in front of the fire in the living room and reached down to stroke his head. Come along, little guy. Seamus looked up at him but didn't move. Jax knew his dog loved his walks, but wasn't a fan of very cold weather. You'll enjoy it when you get going, he laughed, amused by Seamus's laziness. "Do you want to go for a walk?" At the words, "Do you want?" Seamus's ears twitched, and a second later he was standing and wagging his tail. "Is that you, Jax?" his mother called from the direction of the kitchen. "Yes, Mum, just going to the beach quickly with Seamus." He went to find her and saw she was making her famous pork stuffing for the turkey.